Today, I speak with Steve Hall from Revive Stronger, a natural bodybuilder, podcast host, and coach of the coaches. We talk about how to bring up lagging body parts, nutrition when socializing, and how to know what tools to use and when to keep progress going.
So I want to kick things off fairly early in your journey when you were on bodyrecomposition.com and bodybuilding.com, binging every article from Lyle McDonald and Alan Aragon. Can you tell me about a highlight and a lowlight from that period?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was very early on I know you just mentioned that you've had like a number of years getting into the evidence-based scene. And so this was my entry, was kind of stumbling across these guys like Alan Aragon and Lyle McDonald, who true like OGs within the evidence-based space. And I can specifically remember, I don't know if this is a highlight or a low light, but I know within the bodybuilding.com forums, and I don't think Alan came up with this term, but it was if it fits your macros. I came across that through those forums, and I was like well entrenched within the kind of the bro camp, as it were, where there's like good foods, bad foods. And I was like, if I eat clean foods, I'll just gain clean weight, aka muscle, and won't gain fat. That wasn't really working. And I like the way I've always liked science, and I like things that make sense. So I like explanations. I don't like just to trust something or anything like that. I like answers and good reasons and sequential things. And when I kind of read through if it fits your macros and macros the key, and that's the kind of main determinant of how your body composition is going to change, and calories, I really didn't like it at first. I was like, you mean to tell me I've been like shoving brown rice and broccoli and chicken down my throat, taking my Tupperware to like my family's houses and refusing their food because I thought I had to eat these specific foods? And even I know my mum was concerned I developed orthorexia, so kind of like this unhealthy obsession with clean eating and eating specific foods. And so that was kind of like a low light where I was like refusing that data. But then I started to try it. So I started introducing some foods that I would never allow myself to eat. And I was like, I haven't suddenly put on like 10 pounds of fat. I'm looking all right. This is quite a bit more like enjoyable, sustainable, and actually finding if it fits your macros and kind of a flexible dieting. Lyle McDonald termed flexible dieting as his kind of approach to eating, which really was like, hey, if you screw up one day, get back on it. Don't like go and take 10 days off and completely binge. But also it incorporated this calories and macros and kind of calculating those. And there aren't kind of good and bad foods. It's about moderation. And that allowed bodybuilding / kind of body recomposition to be sustainable for me, because I don't think if I had to eat the kind of the going said thing within, like, if you're a coach within this space, is like, look at the way you're training and eating. If you can't sustain that for like years, it's no good, because sustainable and consistency is super important for long-term outcomes. And if I looked at the way I was approaching my diet previously, it certainly was not something that could be sustainable for me long-term, especially like trying to get a girlfriend and go on dates and like be with friends. Like I would have to like lock myself at home and just in the kitchen make my own food, which is not a life anyone wants to live. So that was kind of my, I don't know if that was kind of a low light and mostly a highlight. I would say that was a good highlight, because that really allowed me to then look at bodybuilding as a sustainable thing for me and something much more enjoyable. So that was kind of on the forums. And my real memory, it's funny, the real memory from bodyrecomposition.com was like just reading these articles day in, day out on my commute to work. And I'd even have it up on my computer at work. Like when I've finished like with the jobs I had to do for my job, I was like binging all of this information and just rereading it. And like, I was like, man, this is just gold, because there's loads of things I'd heard about building muscle and what's important for training programs, progressive overload, deloads, fatigue management, these sort of principles, but I'd never really understood how to go about it as a trainee. And it just started like lighting bulbs in my head of, oh, this is actually kind of the science behind it. This is the reason why you do this versus this. And I love that kind of logic and reasoning behind things. So yeah, it was during that time, I definitely wasn't progressing the best in that career at the time, which wasn't within the fitness space. But it was really allowing me to kind of, get my first headway into evidence-based kind of training and nutrition in that regard. I don't know if I really gave like a highlight and a low light, but those are the main memories from that time, which is a long time ago now.
Yeah. And at that time, were you already pursuing bodybuilding in terms of competing, or were you more of a recreational lifter at that time?
Definitely recreational. I hadn't really come across competitive bodybuilding at that time. I wasn't following any like natural bodybuilders. Um, I don't think at that immediate time, but I did very soon after come across Matt Ogus, who was like a huge inspiration for me getting into bodybuilding and competing in it, because I saw he was competing naturally, and he was coached by Eric Helms, who again is a bit of an OG evidence-based practitioner. And I just came across 3DMJ then. I was like, man, I want to do this thing. So it was great that I'd kind of came across the nutritional approach of flexible dieting that allowed that to be sustainable for me. And then was like, oh, I can actually use this as an approach to competing as a natural bodybuilder. So yeah, that's kind of where that started kicking in.
Oh, that's cool. So you mentioned kind of like taking Tupperware to family events. And I know that probably is something you feel you could have been more mindful there. Do you feel like that approach might lead to burnout?
Yeah, I think burnout, because it's not particularly enjoyable when, especially if you're already quite a introverted person, and I don't know, maybe you struggle with social situations. Even if you don't, though, like those family situations and social situations are meant to be kind of like fun, enjoyable, relaxing, not stressful. And if you have to like make yourself to be a bit of a like outsider by eating your own food, and they don't understand, and honestly you don't understand really why you're doing it, because you don't need to. If you have someone to explain to you, you could just go and enjoy it, and like you said, be mindful of what you're eating there and make the rest of your day complement that to make sure that it's still goal driven. You don't have to go wild. And honestly, if you can't control yourself at those events, there's a bigger picture like problem, right? Where you need to improve your food relationship. So yeah, it's the only time now that where I would ever do that is if I was like 5 weeks out from stage and I'm like, hey, I got a bodybuilding show coming up. This is serious stuff. I've only got these many calories to play with. I can't kind of bullshit around guesstimating food and eating stuff that I don't know what's in there, because it potentially could shortcut my progress. But how often am I 5 weeks out from a bodybuilding show? Really, really rare. So that's the only time I'd ever consider that sort of approach to be reasonable for someone.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that it's not reasonable for the vast majority of listeners who are recreational lifters who definitely care more than the average gym goer. But if you're at a, birthday party and everyone's having cake, maybe have a small slice of cake just to include yourself, or whatever you're comfortable with. Don't completely isolate yourself from that situation, because it's going to cause you more stress, and it may also like impact your relationship. So kind of find that right spot for you based on what your goals are.
Yeah, I think I couldn't say it better myself. I think realizing who you are as a person, because I think a lot of people look up to, and I certainly did, like these bodybuilders, and they're normally in prep because that's like what their life is, right? Especially on the enhanced side, they compete like year after year. So they have to be dedicated so much, like so more often, because they are professional and they're doing it so often. But you're like, again, I'm closer to them than the majority of people listening to this because I compete. But in my off season, I'm nowhere near where they're at. And so, yeah, for the majority of people, they don't need to kind of copy what these professionals are necessarily doing. They can scale it to their goals and where they're at.
Yeah, I think something that's really important is thinking about adherence. So something I'll try to do is I'll project myself like 5 years in the future, and I'd be like, why would I fail either this training program or this nutritional approach? And then the reasons that I imagine that I'll fail, those are probably the reasons that I won't adhere to. And I need to like reassess those and see, okay, why wouldn't I adhere to it? Is it too strict? I think people need to kind of have that reflection of who they are as a person and what they can and can't do.
Yeah. Yeah. And the great thing is, to get results, it's actually not that big of a barrier to entry. There are some big rocks you have to get right. But every smaller detail after that, the returns you get are diminishing to a large degree. So yeah, again, a professional bodybuilder is trying to get every little ounce of progress. But for the more average individual who's serious and committed, they could scale that back. Kind of, not that I think Pareto's rule exactly it applies here, but it almost does. Like 20% of what you do is going to get 80% of the results. It's almost as like that. So and there are times you can take it more seriously and scale back. I do that too. So yeah, I think, again, well stated.
Yeah, it's just about finding that strategy. For me, I can be hyper disciplined weekdays, especially breakfast, lunch, kind of every day. So make sure that staple habit's there, and then be more flexible in the evening and socializing. And, that seems to work. And I'm not trying to be a pro bodybuilder, but I'm trying to put on appreciable amount of muscle over the course of a long period.
Yeah, and the brilliant thing with that is, it's just like you said, it seems to be working. Like, if it's working for you, like, you don't have to change anything. Now, could it work better? And do you want it to work better? Then you can start investigating and learning about what could make this better. But if you're happy with the progress you're making and you're happy with like your lifestyle, perfect. Like, that's the best place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I personally want to kind of go slightly more optimal on the training side of things while keeping my nutrition where it is.
Yeah.
So
Nutrition can go on the back burner for a lot of people. There's some real basics you need to get right. I would say to screw it up is kind of challenging.
So kind of going back to the basics, I was going through some of your old content, and you had this OG article say, "I'd die happy knowing this," in relation to calorie balance. You said calories in versus calories out. That's the one message you'd want people to get. So I'm curious, like a decade later, is that still the message you want to get out? And why is it such a challenging concept when it seems so simple?
That's so funny that I wrote that. I can't even remember writing that, but it's funny because when I hear that, I immediately think of why have I forgotten his name? He's a big influencer here in the UK, and his brand was built upon like calorie effing deficit. Was like he just continuously say that, and he was known for it. And obviously, it's a vast oversimplification. Like, there's a lot that goes into that dynamic of calories in and calories out, and it's more challenging for some individuals versus others. As we learn more and more, it's like some people are just genetically more likely to be overweight and over fat versus other people. These are just realisms where I think, at least I, for a time, was like, anyone overweight, it's all in their control. They could definitely lose that weight. It's like, yes, but it might be just as hard for them to lose like 5 pounds as it is for you to lose 20, for example. Like, those are some of the just genetic differences that are out there. So yeah, I think it's a message that has been, James Smith is his name, if you've heard of James Smith.
Yeah.
Some of the listeners probably heard of him. He's quite like an aggressive, like out there individual. So, and he built his brand off that message. So I think he's done a great job of kind of giving that message out there. And I think he's become more nuanced now in his education of how to get to that goal of calorie deficit. But yeah, I think it's hard for people to grasp because it's so confusing still that you get people with PhDs who will be telling you that calories in, calories out, you don't have to worry about calories. It's all about hormones. And then they come out with some really sophisticated language surrounding insulin and, when you have carbohydrates, then it spikes your insulin and then you can't burn fat. And that's the problem. That's your problem. And it's really, they're missing the forest for the trees, or they're putting the cart before the horse. And it does all draw back to the first law of thermodynamics, which is like calorie balance. So it's confusing because there's experts out there who are telling you not to worry about that. There's also, like, I don't know, just your fitness influencers who are really in great shape who say, don't worry about that. I don't worry about that. I just eat these foods and it works perfectly for me. And unfortunately, people have agendas. They sell books, courses, coaching on these things, and it will work for some people. It won't work for other people. But when you look at any diet and why it's successful, it tends to be restricting something. Like if intermittent fasting, it's restricting your window of eating. So you probably eat less. Or if you're doing keto, you're removing all carbs. Now you're removing a whole food group. You're definitely probably going to eat less. And it promotes a lot of satiety through the protein and the fats. But many of these approaches are all doing something to try and remove calories in. So rather than, I think, like pigeonholing yourself to having to follow a diet and it's the diet that worked, it's like, hey, no, there's lots of diets that can work. The principle they work on is calories in versus calories out. You can pick and choose your approach to eating that suits you and your lifestyle and that you enjoy, and like you've mentioned, is sustainable for you. Because I don't know how many people can strictly go like keto or paleo for like their entire life. Again, eating out and socializing, and I don't know, some foods are just worth eating. And you can eat them so long as they fit that paradigm or that principle of calorie balance.
Yeah, I feel like people also like keto specifically because of the quick weight loss that happens, which, is mostly water. So they get really excited saying, hey, I lost 12 pounds in the last week. And while that looks exciting from a scale perspective, it's not necessarily fat loss. So I see the pro of it being that there's some motivation that happens through it. But then the con is like, you're not going to keep losing that 12 pounds. That was a one-time thing. And now if you reintroduce carbohydrates into your diet, you're probably going to put on more water. So don't freak out when you go on the scale.
Yeah, it's that education piece that I think now needs to be there behind some of these messages, like trying to understand why these things occur. And I think even the scale, like some people will say throughout the scale, it's not useful. Like there's influencers that will say that. And it's like, I understand where they're coming from because there's some problems with the scale. And for some people, it can be triggering if they don't understand how to correctly use it, but it's a tool. And most people will find if they're trying to lose fat, they will have to lose weight eventually. And if they're not losing weight, it's probably not losing fat. But like you said, if you have suddenly a higher sodium meal one evening, the next day your weight goes up. For the person that's completely uneducated about that, they're going to freak out and they're going to be like, oh, I don't know, chicken ramen from Wagamama. It's only like 400, 500 calories, but it caused me to gain so much weight and fat. So I can't eat that food. It's like, oh no, this is not the route to go down.
That's funny. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to throw out some quotes that you've said in the past. Give me your first thoughts on it.
Okay.
Just whatever comes to mind. So the first one is absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence.
So I actually literally said this recently because I was commenting on a post by someone else in the field, Milo Wolf, and he was giving some of his thoughts surrounding the pump and how it's not important. And he was suggesting that there's enough evidence to suggest it's nothing for you to focus on. And I still hold by the fact that I don't think that's true at all. I think the evidence is quite mixed. I don't think there's enough evidence to suggest we definitely should focus on it in terms of published literature, but there's also not enough to say it's completely like something we don't need to worry about. And then I think about what does the anecdote, which is a part of evidence-based practice, like bodybuilders over the years Arnie is known for saying things like the pump is like the sweetest thing in the gym possible, right? He's coming everywhere. He's coming in the gym. It's that good of a feeling for him. And it's certainly something he focused heavily on. And he was a very good bodybuilder. And even with my own clients and with myself, I've noticed the kind of correlation with the pump with things that are more hypertrophic. And it's helped me as a diagnostic tool guide technique adjustments, exercise selection, also volume, but it has to be used appropriately in my opinion. So anyway, I'm going down off a rabbit hole talking about the pump when you asked the question about absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But I think it's a really good quote because like a lot of people will discount things, but it's like just because there isn't evidence to suggest that it's useful doesn't mean that there isn't some use. So if something's got a lot of anecdotal support and there's no like actual scientific research on it, maybe it's something to consider. Maybe there's a reason so many people have stuck with this thing for so many years and seen great results with it. Maybe there isn't. Maybe it's complete rubbish, but there's probably something there going on. So yeah, I think it's especially for people in the evidence-based space where they always want like a PubMed link to a study that tells them exactly what the answer is. Remember some of these things that people are doing and they've seen success with for a long time. There might be just a lack of research because they haven't looked into it yet. And they probably will come in and either prove it right or wrong at some stage.
Yeah, that's my experience kind of in the startup world as well. If you just follow kind of, the evidence and the best practices, you may not have a successful startup because there's a lot of innovation that needs to be done. There's a lot of feel. And I know on the evidence side, like people don't like the concept of feel, but that's been my experience. It's like there is this point of just like using your intuition and feel and kind of like remixing what other people have done in the past, even if, that's not what they're teaching in MBA programs or PhDs.
Yeah, I think it's success definitely leaves clues. I do think some people rely too heavily on that anecdote, but when you blend that with the evidence base, the evidence within the published research, I think you get a really good mix. And like you said, there's some things that like science isn't going to be able to give us answers to everything.
Yeah. And for the pump, for me, it really helped me with exercise selection. I was finding I wasn't really able to activate my chest too well 3 or 4 years ago. Everything was just my triceps taking over. And then I found a few exercises where I was able to get a good pump in the chest. And I noticed better gains after that as well.
I think that's been a lot of people's experience. Like they get that the blood flow there is just a great indication that muscle's working really well. Just chasing the pump, I think, can definitely lead you down to making wrong decisions, because the things like novelty, changing things all the time, might get you a better pump, or higher rep ranges and short rest periods might always get you a better pump. But it's not necessarily things you always want to be doing. But when you take that in consideration of a well programmed, like, hey, everything in this like program is principle based, I'm going to pick between a chest press or a dumbbell press. The chest press gets me a better pump. It's like, maybe do that one.
All right. Next one is comparison can be the thief of joy.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, for anyone, but bodybuilders in particular, but anyone within this space, I mean, especially now with social media as it is, you can just feel down in the dumps about your progress, your physique, because with social media, the people you see are the ones with the largest followings, and the people with the largest followings are the people with the craziest physiques. And they're normally either genetic outliers, or they're on some sort of performance enhancing drugs, or a combination of all these sort of factors, which just allows them to look like completely crazy. When I first got into the gym, I don't think I didn't really set any limits on myself. I was like, I even believed, I think I could be like Ronnie Coleman. Like, if I just put in enough hard work and effort, I'll be like Ronnie Coleman. It's like, then you realize, like, hey, my mate's like, his bench press is doubled. Mine's only gone up by like 25%. Why is he so much stronger than me? What's he doing? What's the secret? It's like, we're just all a bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know for myself, I'm never going to have the world's greatest like V taper, or abs or calves. Like, they're just not strengths, but I have really good arms, and I don't have to try for my arms. They just grow no matter what I do. People are jealous of my arms. It's like, well, I'm jealous of your legs, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Like, everyone's got these kind of, I call it like tot trumps. You could compare someone's card to someone else's. Everyone's got their kind of pros and cons and their strengths and weaknesses. And they're all, again, you can't control who your parents are, and that it completely dictates your genetics, and your genetics really control a lot of how far you can go within your physique development. And like I said before, even your ability to get lean is largely controlled by genetics as well. There's a lot you can do. It's like the deck of cards, and then it's how you play with them as an individual and maximize the results you can get from your deck. And I was never someone who like immediately grew loads of muscle. I'm not genetically endowed towards like bodybuilding, but now, having done it for like 15 years and really seriously invested in it, like, when you invest some over average amounts of time and effort into something, you will probably become over average for that thing. So as long as you stick to something and you enjoy it and you embrace that, you're going to become pretty good at it. So yeah, especially as bodybuilders, because when it comes down to it, when you're on stage, you are compared. And if you let your self-worth get determined by your placing and what judges on a judging panel think of you after 30 minutes, like, that's just a bad idea. Like, the joke is, you start bodybuilding to be more confident and feel better about how you look. And then when you start it, you always look in the mirror and you always see all the problems, right? You're like, oh, this is too small. I'm too fat here, all of that. And I think it's just wise to look at, if you're going to compare against anyone, compare against yourself. Where did you start? Where have you got to? And just appreciate your body and your own commitment to the process. Because yeah, otherwise, if you just compare again to the people you see on social media, they're the kind of creme de la creme, and it's easy to feel bad about that. But compare against yourself.
Awesome. So the next one is I want to be the very best. Ash Ketchum.
I don't even know where I said that. That's probably been changed to my new inspiration, who's kind of replaced that sort of phrase, is probably Dateboyo, which is Believe It by Naruto.
Okay.
Where he wanted to become the Hokage of his village, and he was just like, he didn't let anyone stop him, even when they told him he's like an idiot and he's never going to get there. He was just like, I believe it. If I believe it hard enough, it's going to happen one day. And it's the same for me here, where I'm just like, I would, for myself with my bodybuilding, very much like a bit of an obsessive personality. If I go into one endeavor, I just want to do that to the best of my ability. So, I mean, I could probably be an all right runner, an all right cyclist, an all right CrossFitter, an all right bodybuilder, but I want to be the best bodybuilder I possibly can be. And that's kind of where the focus goes. So I don't know what I said that quote in relation to, but that's quite funny. That's where my headspace is now with bodybuilding, and I've exceeded the expectations
Awesome.
that I ever thought I'd be able to achieve, which is quite cool.
Awesome. I got one more here. I'm not a big fan of exercise hierarchies as it's the entire program that matters most.
What immediately always comes to mind with this, it just for some reason solidifies it in a lot of people's heads, is like diet. Like a lot of people realize you can't look at one meal or one item within a diet and be like, hey, that tells me the quality of the entire diet. Like you can't look at my post-workout chocolate milk and be like, oh yeah, that's like highly processed. It's lots of sugar, and yeah, maybe it's got some protein in there, but like I don't think that's a good thing. There's no fiber, and you can't then quantify the quality of my entire diet based off that one meal. And so you need to know the context of everything else. It's just like, hey, if I've got a leg extension in my program, you might argue that a squat's better, or a sissy squat, or a like reverse Nordic, because that gets the quad in a more lengthened position. There's more stimulus produced. It's like, yeah, but you don't know what else I'm doing in my program. So I think it's the entire program is definitely what leads to the results, not one exercise. So I think it's not great to like try and say, if I had to pick, would I pick a squat or a hack squat or a leg press? I'm like, they're all great. Like, why don't you at some point use all of those tools at some time? Just like, hey, blueberries, strawberries, raspberries. Why are we trying to categorize and hierarchy, like give them a hierarchy? They're all great things to include in your diet at some point. So that's kind of the why I kind of said that, because, but the unfortunate thing is people love these kind of black and white comparisons. They like to know what's the best quad movement.
Of course. Like, they want to know what the S tier is, right? If it's C tier, I'm not going to do it, even if it's working for you, because it's not S tier on this, this cool list someone made.
And it's hard because I look at that and I'm like, when you've worked with a lot of clients, you realize some people have only access to certain exercises. So that's a limitation in its own right. They might not have a hack squat. They might only have a barbell back squat. Okay. So that rules out that hack squat anyway. And then some people, like you said, have limitations with mobility, or maybe it's injuries. And so they have to rule out certain exercises or ranges of motions or techniques that just aren't useful for them. I mentioned the reverse Nordic, theoretically really good for the quads, puts the rec fem under a big stretch, but they're so uncomfortable. I can't do them. I don't have the mobility within my ankles to like sit on them. It's just like, I tried them. I was like, I can't do this. So it's kind of one of those where you have to take the individual into context. And then also they change over time. So movements inherently, once you use them for long enough, they get stale, maybe a bit of an overuse injury with that movement. And so it might be useful, and your best exercise might then change for that time to something else. So yeah, I think it's just a bit of a fallacy to focus on.
Yeah, it's also what's best in a certain context, right? If you have to do 8 warm-up sets and it's really hard to set up at your gym, that could be a limitation. Or if it's hard to load the movement, that could be a limitation. So it's like best in what context makes more sense than best overall, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like, I know for me, I like single arm delt movements. I like single arm lat movements, but man, they take double the time basically to using both arms. So It's like, if I ain't got the time, then, or a client hasn't, then I'm going to program for 2 arms, because it's more important to get the required volume in than it is to have this specific exercise done.
Awesome. So I want to talk about programming. There's a kind of archetype that I think exists where it's someone who may be a recreational lifter who's maybe late intermediate on their upper body because they've been doing the bro workouts, but they've been neglecting their legs. So how would you think about programming for their legs if they wanted to bring it up? Would you like treat them as a novice there, or how would you think through that?
Yeah, so that's definitely a thing. And it's even another example I always think of is like powerlifters. They don't often target their side delts or their arms because they don't do direct work on those muscle groups because it's just not required, or calves, for example. So they're effectively kind of newbies for those muscles. They grow very quickly. So you can almost approach training differently for those. So you might find their volume requirements are actually quite low in comparison to some of the upper body. And if they're a priority, my first port of call for priority muscle groups is to think about where are they trained and when are they trained. So muscles that are trained earlier within the week and earlier within sessions are probably going to have, there's less fatigue when you're going to train them. So you're going to be in a better position to perform at your best and give it your best go. And so whilst we don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that that's definitely going to be beneficial, we don't also have much evidence on that at all. And I have found anecdotally that that's been really beneficial is like, hey, if you want your calves to grow and you leave them at the end of your leg workout, your calves probably ain't going to grow that well. But if you put them at the start, now you're prioritizing, now you put good energy forward for them, real focus for them, they're probably going to start growing. So when I'm thinking about that person with their legs, I'd be like, okay, so rather than starting Monday with a chest day, as it's International Chest Day, we're going to make it a quad day for you, right? And make sure we prioritize your legs and the development there. And then it's just about seeing, okay, so how much volume do they seem to need for that muscle group? Like I said, it's probably going to be lower given that they're less well trained. And then just over time, auto-regulating that based off their performance and a recovery feedback. If they're like, hey, Steve, I know we started with 6 sets of quads a week, but now I'm just like blasting through that. It's barely feeling like it's challenging me at all. And my progress is slowed down a bit. It's like, okay, so you're clearly recovering. Let's try adding maybe a set or 2 and then see how they get on with that. So it's the same sort of process. It's interesting because I think a lot of people think programming for a novice versus someone advanced, like it's this hugely different thing. It's like actually all the principles of like volume, intensity, exercise selection, they're all the same for each individual. It's just you then individualize based off the feedback you're getting from that person. And like I said, probably the volume demands for a newbie is like pretty damn low. That's why they can train like 2-3 times a week and see great gains. So they'll probably find their legs can quickly catch up their upper body because they just get all those newbie gains coming through.
Awesome. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to throw some images on the screen of people that may have inspired you and just tell me kind of your first take or something you learned from them. So the first person is Matt Ogus.
Hey, so he's already come up. So yeah, Matt was basically, when I got onto YouTube, he was one of the people that I followed the most. And he really went down the route of vlogging his contest prep, his natural bodybuilding prep, and diet, training, the whole works. And he, I'm sure you'd agree, Varun, is in incredible shape. Like if he had his like vest off here, like perfect abs, like round cap delts, like full muscle bellies. Even at this stage, I don't think like he's now even better than he was. But like when I was first following him in 2014, I was like, he is goals. I followed like programs he would do. He did like 531, Jim Wendler's 531. I'd follow that program. He'd wear like Chuck Taylors to the gym and I'd be wearing my Chuck Taylors.
Nice.
So yeah, he was definitely someone who like I kind of idolized for his physique, but also his approach to training and nutrition, because he followed an evidence-based kind of approach, which was pretty unique for someone like a lot of people who have good genetics, which Matt definitely does. They tend to rely on those and then don't worry about educating themselves further. But he was definitely interested in educating himself further to get even better results. So yeah, I respected him for that. And yeah, he was someone who, and I continue to want to look like.
And how did you find his content through the noise? Because one thing I find is when I talk with the average recreational lifter, they're kind of still at the top of the funnel at like the V shred and the athlete X level, and they don't seem to be able to make it down the funnel, if that makes sense, to more of the evidence-based content that you provide, for example.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how I came across him. I know I used to watch, like, if you remember, did you ever watch the Hodge twins as an example?
Yeah, I definitely did. They were pretty
funny.
funny.
There you go. Do whatever the F you want to do at the end of their videos, right? And they didn't really appeal to me, but I saw some of their videos and they were growing quite a lot. So maybe he collaborated with them at some point. I also, Chris Jones was someone who Matt collaborated with quite a lot, who I know is still in the space, actually, who I haven't watched for ages, like Pump Chasers, I think his brand is. And so I don't know if I caught him through one of these other channels and he collaborated with them. I can't actually remember, but he was definitely the person that got me to find 3DMJ. So again, I kind of have to appreciate him for that, because I think 3DMJ have done a lot of good for the space.
Speaking of 3DMJ, look at you just doing the transition here. Eric Helms.
So I actually just emailed Eric Helms today to organize a podcast with him, which is really surreal to talk about, because again, he was someone who I essentially like idolized for his knowledge and his ability to speak through the research. And he is truly like, he kind of epitomizes, I know a lot of people say he looks like Captain America, but like the values of Captain America in terms of like, not that Eric is like righteous, but I feel like if there's someone who I think is going to be like less biased, more honest, and really true to like scientific communication, and just has very good morals. I would think of Eric, which I think is why, again, Captain America is kind of the similar kind of archetype in that sense. And yeah, he recently turned pro, which is a huge inspiration for me too, because I don't think Eric would say he's particularly genetically well endowed. I don't think he's got bad genetics by any means. You can't turn pro and have bad genetics. I don't think that's possible unless you somehow go in some weird show that allows you to win it and you aren't pro caliber. But to see him and his journey, yeah, it's an inspiration to me, because that now is like on my mind. I want to go pro now and like follow in his footsteps. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on Eric.
Awesome. So the next is some books that you mentioned. Is there a book here that sticks out that really resonated with you?
Yeah, so probably the biggest one of these was The Scientific Principles of Strength Training. Whilst it being strength training, they talked about hypertrophy a lot, and the principles apply very similarly. And I've talked about that book being like seeing through the matrix. So I know this was the book that Mike Israetel, Chad Wesley Smith, and James Hoffman wrote from Renaissance Periodization. And it really, again, I had read Starting Strength, I'd read Practical Programming, but like Practical Programming, there's a lot of programs in there, and they suggest like these Texas method and various programs like this that are good for various outcomes, but they didn't really boil down like the principles of specificity, overload, progressive overload, all those sort of fatigue management, those characteristics. Whereas the Scientific Principles did, like it principled everything within there. So for me, that has just been a standout book. And actually, it's what led me to initially want to bring Mike Israetel over to the UK for a seminar, which was his first international seminar, I believe, in 2015, I think, and then bring him onto the podcast. And then that's when I started interviewing experts on the podcast. So that book, like, spearheaded a heck of a lot of good things. So yeah, I think it was a great read, and yeah, I appreciate it, and I appreciate the people that wrote it.
Do you still have a physical copy somewhere?
I actually never got a physical copy. I don't know if they had one. Not when I first purchased it. It was just an ebook. So I have the ebook, but no, not a physical copy. I have a physical copy of all the other ones, though.
So you mentioned progressive overload. I think it's a term that's kind of mentioned, like we were saying, calories in, calories out. It's just mentioned all the time. Like all you have to do is progressive overload. But a challenge I see with people at the gym is they'll do progressive overload at all costs. Like they'll ruin their technique, or they'll change their tempo. Like, how do you think about that with your clients so that they are actually progressing as opposed to just progressing in the logbook, but maybe not actually?
Yeah, it is a tricky one, because I think having first of all, when I consider overload, that's actually what's causing growth, is an overload. The progressive overload, Brian Miner's done a lot of work demonstrating this and talking about it. The progression of the overload is actually more indicative of you having grown muscle. So if you hit a PR and say that's progressive overload, that's because you've done all this work of overload that's led to you growing muscle that then allows you to perform better. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg scenario. You don't actually have to hit a PR to have grown. So that's something I always demonstrate and describe to my clients, so that they don't feel bad for maybe repeating a performance or leaving some reps in the tank, that sort of thing. It's like, it's still overloading. It's still a stress response that the body's going to have to respond to and grow. And if you do that, enough of that for long enough, you're going to see a PR coming. But progressive overload also isn't just PRs. It is also within this kind of window of overload. So say you do a squat for 3 RAR in week 1, and you do 100 for 10. Then next week, 2 RAR, you do 100 for 11. That is actually a progression of overload, even though it's not a PR, because it's in this like overloading paradigm, if that makes sense, like in this threshold. So anything that's like, theoretically, you can leave many reps in reserve and still grow, but I think practically anywhere around 3 or 4 is kind of your threshold. You're training hard enough for growth. So long as you're doing that for like 5 to 30 repetitions, you're providing an overload response. Now you need to meet a volume overload. So for volume, it appears like anywhere between, a lot of people talk about 10 to 20 sets as being like, hey, this is a really good place to start growing. I'm going to say maybe 6 to 8 sets is like this minimum threshold. But all the way up to that upper end is like, hey, you could grow more if you can recover from it. So long as you're doing enough in terms of volume and sets, and you're training hard enough with enough load on the bar, you're creating a growth response. And then you just want to try and beat this week's performance the next week. And this is why I think it's useful to give yourself a little bit of runway within a mesocycle. So don't go all guns blazing week 1, train to failure for all the volume. Maybe reduce your volume a little bit and or and have some reps in the tank so that next week you can beat it and produce a really productive stimulus without excessive fatigue. So you can continue to progressively overload over a long period of time. And when you go for that week 1, you meet those thresholds at least for growth. That's the time to set your foundation for technique as well, where you have a technique of good controlled eccentrics, whether or not you're pausing a portion of the lift or not, and your range of motion is set. And then you look to maintain that over the weeks and don't let that degrade. But I do think, even myself included, because I'm always trying to be progressive, because I do think it's important to have a bit of a progressive mentality where you are trying to beat the weeks before performance. And sometimes when you do that, technique can degrade a little bit. Maybe you speed up your eccentric, you remove a pause, maybe your range of motion isn't quite as good or it's not as controlled. And then you just have to be honest with yourself and then just take it back, reset it a little bit, So I think it's inevitable for people who really are trying to push for progress that, like, hey, something you might think you've progressed, but did you just kind of speed up, or you reduce your range of motion and you made it easier for yourself? And if that happened, that's fine. Just don't keep doing that, because that's probably not the most productive way to train.
Yeah, it's not the most productive way to train, but at least you're trying to progress. And I think that mindset is positive, but you do need to take a look in the mirror every once in a while and say, okay, do I need to adjust something here? Is something not the right long-term approach?
Yeah, exactly. And I think also, as we've mentioned before, context is important. If you are someone who's been training for like 10 years, you're not going to see a PR very frequently. But if you've been training for a year, you can be a bit more pushy with your progressions. So the majority of the people I work with have been training similar to yourself, like a good 5 years. So their PRs come a little bit more sparingly. But I think having that progressive mentality is important, because you don't want to get you could fall out of those thresholds theoretically, that stuff becomes too easy for you.
Awesome. So I got one more here. I'm not a huge anime fan, but this is Attack on Titan.
Yeah, this is Hanjay and Levi. And so this is when she's about to basically commit suicide, essentially. You haven't seen Attack on Titan?
No.
Oh man, you got to see it. But you said you're not an anime fan, but this is a good anime for, I don't know, an introductory anime.
It's a good intro to anime? All right, I'll give it a go.
It's pretty intense. If you're I don't know, you like action and gore and a lot of emotion, you'll like Attack on Titan.
I like all of that stuff. Okay.
And if you like sci-fi stuff, it's not realistic, right? So
yeah, based on everything behind me, I'm definitely into that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, exactly. So she's about to fight some titans and basically sacrifice herself. But the Levi is probably my favorite character from Attack on Titan, just because, one, he's badass, but also he is generally emotionless. So he kind of keeps his emotions to himself, and he can almost seem like he's a bit psychotic. But this is moments like this where he's when he shows some emotion and it's really heartfelt. And it's just at this moment they're devoting their heart to the cause, and there's a lot of emotion behind it. And so I listen to these anime remixes when I'm in the gym, and they're doing these bits and bobs, and I
see the anime tattoos and stuff going on. So
exactly. So I've got a Levi tattoo. He's actually getting finished in a couple of weeks because it's very big on my calf. And
are you really selective about who does your tattoos?
I was not when I started, because I didn't quite realize the industry that is tattooing is actually very similar to a lot of industries, right? You have people who are, if you want to step on stage for the first time, I'm a great coach for you. But if you're, I don't know, a 6-year-old woman dealing with menopause and, I don't know, you've had children and, I don't know, you've got these injuries, bits and pieces like that, I might be able to help you. I probably can, because I'll be honest, I know the principles apply to a lot of people, but I wouldn't be the best coach. I can say that hand on heart. But the first timer I would be. And it's similar with tattoos. The first lot I got was on this arm with the black and gray. It's all Dragon Ball Z. So I've got Goku and Vegeta and things. But I didn't really realize there's people that specialize in anime tattoos. I just thought there's good tattooists and they just tattoo whatever. That's stupid thinking. There's people that actually specialize in it. So this arm which is all Naruto, is from Sam Andrews. He's in a town just by me, actually. It's only like an hour and a half away, which is great. And yeah, he's a very good anime specialist tattooist. So now he's like my guy. Like I just am like, I quite like the idea of the aesthetic being similar versus lots of different interpretations or kind of methods and styles. So yeah, anyway, I go to a specific person for that. I follow a lot of anime tattooists though. There's a lot of good ones.
Awesome. So I want to move into something. You've mentioned you're someone who loves control, and controlling variables is very important for you. Something I actually have a challenge with is lean bulking. I find cutting relatively easy, but I find that my bulks can kind of get out of hand as I have a big appetite. So I'm curious, what do you track, and just any tips on lean bulking?
So yeah, I like control, and that's probably exemplified by, if you were to check my MyFitnessPal, I probably have a streak of over a decade, which is kind of wild, right? I don't know how many people there are that can say that. It's not to say I track and weigh every item of food I ever eat. Like, to have that streak, I need to have tracked on Christmas Day, right? It's normally I log into MyFitnessPal and I maybe log like my breakfast. Then I'm like, oh, it's Christmas dinner now. Like maybe I eyeball it if I'm in prep or in a diet phase. If I'm massing, I'll just be mindful, you know?
Yeah.
So I think my tips for someone lean gaining and getting comfortable with that is not changing their diet too much from when they've been dieting. That's normally the biggest thing that people get into trouble with, is they're like, oh yeah, I get to bulk now. That means I get to change my oats for like Cocoa Pops.
Yeah.
It's like, man, you've just really reduced the satiety of the food you're eating. And maybe they go to eat out more often and they just get a bit too flexible and loose. Whereas if you just are like, hey, got my cut diet, I'm just going to increase the portions of that and I'll see how I feel. Once you start feeling like, man, I feel stuffed a lot of the time, this is a bit uncomfortable. Hey, now you rotate out some of those oats, put in some Cocoa Pops. If you rush that process too quickly, you put in too many palatable foods that aren't satiating, it's so easy to overeat. This is why some people will talk about like, hey, you don't have to reduce the amount of food you eat to lose fat. It's like, you do have to reduce the calories, as we talked about, but actually your food volume could go up during a diet phase. But the trouble is when someone has that good base of food volume and they then go into a mass and now they're actually eating less food volume for more calories and they're less full, it's like, damn, like that could harm your progress. So yeah, I think it's just making sure in that initial transition, just like I always think of like Formula One racing, when they're going down that bend, they have to slow down and really take that bend carefully, and then they can go on the straight again. So when you're going through a cut and you're down the straight and then you go through the bend, and that's that transition towards the mass, take that slowly, carefully, climb up. Mike Israel talks about this hedonic staircase. So like the tastiness of your foods, slowly travel up there over time, and then you're down on the straight, and then massing will be nice, slow, progressive for you, and you should be in a more comfortable position. Yeah, it's that unfortunate rebound people sometimes experience. And sometimes it can be because they've dieted for too long. Like they're already exhibiting many signs of excess, like diet fatigue. And it's just like, I don't know, some binging's creeping in, and maybe they should have cut the diet a bit sooner. So it's just playing safe with that. And don't be afraid to go slow. You can grow muscle in a deficit. You can grow muscle. It's easier at maintenance, and it's even easier in a surplus, but you don't have to rush to that surplus if it means there's risk of you gaining excess fat.
Yeah, I just find the mental aspect really interesting. When I'm cutting, the mental is like, okay, make sure you're under this calorie goal at all costs. Like that's the mindset, and it's pretty easy for me to execute. But when I'm bulking, it's like, oh, I had a hard leg day today, so like maybe an extra few hundred calories isn't such a bad idea. And then you're eating like hyper palatable food, and then you maybe want a little bit more. I'm not saying binging, but it's just consistently being a few hundred calories over what the target is seems to happen.
Yeah, I think it's that easy, like short-term kind of win you want. And what you have to remind yourself of is the longer term vision, and be like, if I can not have those extra 200 calories and I can gain, therefore, for like even longer, I can gain more muscle and have less fat to have to lose.
Yeah.
It's like, like just keep that longer term vision in mind. But I totally know what you mean, because I work with a lot of people who have struggled with that. Like they essentially are really good in their diet phases, and then massing, they get complacent. And so they're great at losing fat and gaining fat, but not so much muscle.
Yeah, for sure. So today I want to finish something off with a kind of a fun question. You've been posting pictures of pizzas for a year, with a bunch of them being like Neapolitan. style pizzas. So tell me about what makes a pizza great instead of good. And then tell me what's the best pizza you ever had.
This is amazing. You've done some research because I was posting pizzas so regularly on my content, but I haven't for ages. I still eat normally a Domino's every other week.
Domino's.
Because we have a takeaway every week, basically, and I pick Domino's as my choice, and then my partner picks her choice, which is not Domino's. So Domino's is not my favorite, but it is up there. I do like a Domino's. Neapolitan is my favorite pizza for sure, and I've been to Naples and I ate 2 pizzas a day every day I was there. So for lunch and dinner was just a Neapolitan pizza. And what makes a really good pizza is the base. That's the most important thing for me. So if you screw up the base, like it's hard or it's like stale, like you want a nice fluffy crust, you want it like crisp and thin on the bottom. The base is just like, that's the foundation for everything. Then the tomato sauce. So you don't want a bland, tasteless tomato sauce. You want to be tasty. You want it to be well seasoned, that sort of thing. And then I like just mozzarella cheese on top. Not too many toppings. You can, like, people try and chuck loads of toppings on, and it normally is trying to hide a bad pizza underneath. That's at least the way I see it. You can judge a pizza by its mozzarella. Mozzarella by its margherita pizza. So for me, if you do a really good margherita, you can be pretty sure every other pizza on the menu is going to be great. But if margherita sucks, nothing else is going to be any good because you've screwed up the foundation of a great pizza.
That's actually my test when I go to an Italian restaurant. I'll get a margherita pizza because it's like a good test to be like, how good is the food here?
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome.
If they got too many options as well, normally that's a bad sign. If they've got like a handful, great. But if they've got like 50 pizzas, I'm like, oh, these aren't going to be good, are they?
No, don't get pizza at Cheesecake Factory where the menu's like 14 pages long. It's probably not going to be good. Awesome. Steve, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Where can everyone find you?
Yeah, thank you. This has been a different style of chat and I've appreciated it. It's been fun. I've thought about a lot of things that I haven't thought about for a long time. So yeah, hopefully there was some value in there as well. It's been fun. So people can find me. I'm most regularly on Revive Stronger on Instagram, or they can search revivestronger.com and they can find the website for our coaching and everything that's there. The podcast is also there. So I run my own podcast where I get to interview people like Eric Helms, which is really cool, and like stay on the cutting edge of research for evidence-based practice. So if people are interested in a deeper dive into that sort of thing, they can definitely check out the Revive Stronger podcast on YouTube, Spotify, all podcast providers. So yeah, thank you once again.
Take care. Bye.